The stories of great U.S. mobsters like Al Capone and John Gotti, whose public fame provoked the ire of the highest echelons of state power, prompted efforts to imprison mobsters by any available means. Black gangsters also had such a precedent, exemplified by Mr. Untouchable, Leroy Nicky Barnes. His photo on the cover of a magazine caused genuine anger in U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Understandably, no president would want to see one of the nation's main drug lords, with about 3,000 dealers generating millions of dollars, on the cover of the New York Times. If you're interested in hearing how a kid from the African-American ghetto managed to create one of the largest and most successful drug networks in U.S. history, meet Leroy Nicky Barnes. Leroy Barnes was born on October 15, 1933, in Harlem, New York. The atmosphere in young Leroy's family was far from favorable. His mother, a modest housewife, endured beatings and humiliation from his father. Barnes's father was not a model family man. He never had a permanent job and earned his living by betting, organizing card games, and doing occasional part-time jobs. Growing up, Leroy referred to his father as a man who always had money for nice clothes and booze but never for paying rent. Over time, Barnes's father became an alcoholic, and the beatings he inflicted on his wife became more frequent, often affecting young Leroy as well. As a result, Nicky Barnes preferred to spend all his time on the streets. By the age of 9, he had already broken the law for the first time. Together with a friend, he worked as a shoe shiner. One day, an intoxicated man asked him to clean his shoes. After Leroy shined his shoes, the man pulled out a wallet and asked how much he owed. The amount of money in the wallet stunned Leroy so much that, instead of answering, he snatched the money from the hapless customer's hands and ran away. However, he didn't get far. The police confronted Barnes and immediately arrested him. Barnes became intimately acquainted with drugs at home. While cleaning, little Leroy accidentally came across a bag containing some powder. He reasoned that his father had taken the bag for safekeeping to make money. After thinking about it, Leroy siphoned off some powder from the bag and sold it on the street that same day. Strangely enough, his father didn't even notice the loss. That's when Barnes first touched a gun. Harlem was a paradise on earth, or so it seemed in his memories, but in reality, the situation was different. There were many youth gangs on the streets, and Leroy joined one of them. His gang often fought with other gangs, and its members enjoyed using homemade firearms. Leroy acquired one, but he didn't have to use it against an enemy gang. One day, returning home, Leroy witnessed another argument between his parents. The conversation grew loud and was about to turn into a fight when his father took a swing at his mother. Leroy shouted at him to leave her alone. His father threatened him, and Leroy responded by shooting him. However, the powder charge was too weak, and everyone present was only slightly frightened. Barnes was lucky to have all his fingers intact, and his father only got a scratch on his jacket from the bullet. After this incident, Barnes decided to leave home and take real revenge on his father. With the help of his gang friends, they knew exactly where Barnes Sr. worked. One night, they showed up at his workplace where Leroy's father was working night shifts and alone. At first, the young thugs planned to kill him but limited themselves to threats. Shortly after this incident, Barnes Sr. left the family. The departure of his father didn't change the path Leroy had chosen. He decided to follow a criminal path, though not always successfully. Barnes, who had already had his first taste of cocaine, decided with a friend to rob a drug dealer. Barnes's friend, having visited the dealer's house the day before under the pretext of buying drugs, noticed that the dealer was unarmed and only had 2 or 3 guards. The next day, the friends went to the dealer's address. When they broke into the apartment, demanding money and threatening with weapons, they didn't notice a whole crowd forming behind them. Having run into the apartment, they forgot to close the door, and now all the neighbors had gathered because of the noise. Leroy's friend managed to escape through the hallway, and Barnes had to jump out of a window. 3 policemen were standing below, but Leroy was lucky enough to escape from them. Gradually, Leroy became more noticeable on his street, not because of any deeds, but because of his appearance. Unlike his friends, who spent all their money on drugs, Leroy bought expensive and stylish clothes. As it turned out, Leroy Barnes was not the only connoisseur of stylish clothes in the neighborhood. Soon, he was noticed by a local drug dealer nicknamed Fat Irby. Irby appreciated Leroy's fashionable clothes and personal qualities, using him as a career and eventually assigning him more responsible tasks. One of the first such assignments was to pick up a bag of paid-for heroin in a nearby neighborhood. Barnes handled this assignment well and began performing courier duties regularly. Big money started coming into Leroy's life, and with the drugs, he couldn't imagine a day without a dose of heroin, often mixed with cocaine for a cooler effect. The money he earned from Irby was no longer enough, so Barnes resorted to stealing. He broke into parked cars, hoping to find something valuable inside that he could sell to buy dope. During one of these car break-ins, Leroy was arrested. The court sentenced him to 3.5 years in prison. Of these years, Barnes served only 1.5 years, gaining early release thanks to parole. He also managed to get rid of his addiction in prison. From that moment on, he decided he would only deal in selling drugs, not using them. Leroy decided not to get involved with Fat Irby anymore. He organized a gang of his friends and began to earn money for a large batch of goods. The group broke into houses, threatened with weapons, and demanded valuable items. Barnes wasn't even afraid of worn clothes. During one robbery, he surprised his accomplices by forcing an elderly woman to take off her clothes because she was wearing very expensive garments that could be sold for a profit. Gradually, the gang acquired the necessary money and then a good car. They also found a regular supplier who sold quality heroin. Barnes preferred to sell only at night. In the mornings, he would divide the heroin into portions and put them into several bags. He hid these bags in secluded places near where he would set up meetings for his dealers. Barnes tried to keep heroin in his home for as little time as possible. The business grew quickly, which wasn't surprising. As a former addict, Barnes understood exactly what other addicts wanted and gave it to them. He started marking the bags of heroin he sold with black duct tape, which became his mark of quality. Addicts from all over Harlem sought these bags because Leroy was not selling a highly diluted product. Barnes no longer sold heroin personally. Instead, his dealers did it. He even had a bodyguard. However, since Barnes was in no apparent danger, the bodyguard served more of a representational function, signaling the high status of whom he guarded. Soon, however, something happened that Barnes had tried hard to avoid. He had enough money to surround himself with the toughest bodyguards, but even they could hardly help him in the situation. He had fallen victim to his wife's tattling. Leroy's wife, Nita, met her childhood friend. The girls hadn't seen each other for years, and they talked about their childhood and personal lives. When the friend found out who Nita had married, she asked, "Is this the same Nicky Barnes? Can he sell me some powder?" Nita, who knew what her husband was doing, replied that of course, he could. The friend turned out to be a police informant. A few days after that meeting, the police burst into Barnes's apartment and searched it. Because Barnes was careful, they didn't find any drugs, but circumstantial evidence in the form of a large amount of cash and the tools Barnes used to pack the powder was enough to charge him. Leroy Nicky Barnes was brought back before the court, which sentenced him to 5 years in prison. Barnes was to serve his sentence close to home at the Green Haven Correctional Facility. At the same time, Matthew Madonna, a mafioso from the Lucky's family, was serving his 20-year sentence there. His meeting with Madonna changed Leroy's life. The 24-year-old Madonna was not some small-time dealer. He was in the business of supplying and selling heroin using a network called the French Connection. Heroin was coming into the United States from all over the world, and one of the largest drug trafficking networks was the French Connection. The network began in the French city of Marseille after the war. In this port city, criminal masterminds were the Guarini brothers. In 1947, the brothers became of interest to American intelligence services, who needed their help. Marseille was gripped by strikes that threatened the export of American goods to France. The strikes were organized by local communists who opposed the Marshall Plan, a program of economic aid to European countries. To prevent disruptions, the CIA was willing to do anything, even ally with local gangsters. The CIA provided the Guarini brothers with everything they needed to combat the strikers, and they quickly restored order in the city. In 1950, the situation repeated, with striking workers jeopardizing supplies for the war in Indochina. The CIA again turned to the Guarini brothers, whose services to restore order in Marseille cost the Americans $2 million and several crates of weapons. After securing the supply line for the Americans, the Gotti brothers began using the port to receive opium raw materials from Indochina, process them into heroin, and send them to the United States. Matthew Madonna found himself in prison on a murder charge. Leroy and Matthew had a lot in common. They were nearly the same age, had spent their childhoods in New York City, and hit it off quickly. All their conversations centered around heroin. Leroy would tell Matthew about the challenges of selling it, and Matthew, with more experience, shared his thoughts on what an ideal organization for selling would be. Leroy admired Matthew, particularly the family spirit that distinguished the Italians from other prisoners. He later recalled how a whole group of friends and their children came to visit Matthew, while Leroy himself never had visitors. Madonna was interested in Barnes, hoping to use his help to sell his goods in Harlem. Shortly before Leroy's release from prison, Madonna offered him cooperation, and Barnes accepted. Matthew's brother, Frank, provided Leroy with everything he needed immediately after his release. Barnes received half a kilogram of heroin for sale and $2,000 as a gift. With this money, he was able to buy a car and rent a secluded place to set up a stash house. Frank Madonna continued to support Leroy and helped him with advice. One day, Barnes had a conflict with another black drug dealer, Steve Austin, who decided he could sell his products on the same streets as Leroy. Barnes was determined to shoot him, but Frank managed to dissuade him from such a rash act. "Your customers aren't interested in which of you is the tougher guy," Frank said. "They're only interested in the quality of the product, and you have no problem with that." The Madonna brothers saw Barnes as a long-term investment that it would be foolish to lose over some minor turf dispute. Frank advised Barnes to cede his streets to a competitor and move to another neighborhood. Regarding revenue, Leroy didn't have to worry. If his product was truly good, buyers would find the sellers. Frank Madonna emphasized the importance of safety, advising Leroy to stay as far away from the drugs as possible, ideally without touching them at all. Frank advised Barnes to delegate all the work to his employees and remain in the shadows, only coordinating their actions. Leroy strictly forbade his subordinates from mentioning anything related to the business in telephone conversations, convinced that the police could tap their phones. As it turned out, he was right. It is not known what exactly attracted the attention of the police to one of Barnes's closest associates, Reggie, but his phone had already been tapped. On January 29, 1965, Barnes was arrested while at Reggie's apartment. After the arrest, the police officers went with Barnes to the apartment where the heroin was being packed. A search was conducted there, and the police confiscated $500,000 worth of heroin. Barnes's arrest was the culmination of a lengthy investigation by the Bronx District Attorney's Office and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Out on bail, Barnes contacted his attorney. They tried to challenge the legality of the wiretap and arrest, but their efforts were unsuccessful. A jury found Leroy Nicky Barnes guilty of drug possession and sentenced him to 15 years in prison. He was to serve his sentence in the familiar Green Haven prison, the same one he had left only 3 years earlier. In prison, Barnes became friends with local African Americans and even converted to Islam. He spent a lot of time studying African history, influenced by the popular concept of the time that all the world's cultural heritage, including Western, originally appeared in Africa and was later appropriated by whites. Barnes became a supporter of a movement called the Nation of Islam. This is a political and religious movement of African Americans that was founded back in the 1930s. Leroy vowed never to abuse substances again and gave up pork. During these months, Leroy virtually stopped socializing with Matthew Madonna and his entourage. Madonna, still serving his time, was ironic about Leroy and his new hobbies. It's worth noting that although there was always some tension between Italians and African Americans in Green Haven, it never escalated into open confrontation. The parties preferred to simply ignore each other. There was one Italian in prison who, for some reason, could not communicate with other Italians and instead became close to the black prisoners, often standing up for them against the Italian clan. His name was Joe Gallo. Joe and his brothers were considered the main rebels in the Cosa Nostra and one of the toughest gangs in the history of the American Mafia. In prison, Barnes and Gallo became friends, and there were rumors that Joe was even thinking of becoming a heroin supplier for Barnes, but it's all at the level of rumors. Barnes later recalled conversations with Joe. Most often they discussed literature. Joe loved to read, and among his favorite writers were the French existentialists Sartre and Camus. It was from Joe that Leroy learned about the works of the famous Niccolò Machiavelli, which he then often and with pleasure quoted. According to one version, it was Joe Gallo who got Leroy out of prison early. When he found himself at large, he immediately involved Barnes's lawyer, who quickly found numerous procedural violations. According to another version, which Barnes himself adheres to, it was different. There is no mention of any help from Gallo. Instead, Barnes recounts that while perusing criminal law journal articles in their library, he came across an article on Katz v. the United States. Charles Katz was a bookmaker who was being investigated by the FBI. The FBI was particularly interested in his telephone conversations, which the cautious Katz conducted only from a phone booth near his apartment. The FBI installed a listening device in the booth and gained access to his conversations. Katz was soon arrested and charged with the federal crime of transmitting betting information. Katz's attorneys tried to challenge the indictment, appealing that the agents did not have a warrant allowing them to use the listening devices. Thus, the tapes of the conversations in the FBI's possession violated the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and requires that any search warrants be issued by a court only with probable cause. At first, the defense's arguments failed to impress the judge, and Katz was convicted. However, the case went to the Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled in Katz's favor, establishing a significant precedent for privacy and the need for warrants for wiretapping. This legal precedent helped Barnes challenge his own conviction. By citing Katz v. United States case, his lawyer successfully argued that the wiretap evidence used against him was obtained illegally, leading to his early release from prison. Once free, Barnes resumed his activities with renewed caution, applying the lessons he learned about legal vulnerabilities and the importance of maintaining a low profile. However, the defense attorneys were able to appeal the conviction, and Katz was released. The judge ruled that the phone booth Katz used for his conversations was constitutionally protected territory where Katz was entitled to his privacy. It was this case that Barnes' attorney cited during his retrial. The judge was persuaded by the argument, and Leroy Nicky Barnes was freed, having served less than 4 years of his 15-year sentence. After leaving prison, Barnes began creating a completely new organization. There is a version that conversations with Joe Gallo prompted him to do so, but again, these are just rumors. Barnes chose Italian crime families as his role models. On the streets of Harlem, there was no place for disparate gangs feuding with each other. Instead, a huge corporation with its own strict laws and rules emerged. Barnes always remembered that he had once been a heroin addict himself. He believed that because of this experience, he knew better what kind of goods the customers on the street wanted. This is why he tried to recruit helpers from former drug addicts. The leadership of the organization, called the Council, consisted of 7 people: Barnes, Joseph Hayton, Wallace Rice, Thomas Foreman, Ismail Muhammad, Frank James, and Guy Fisher. Half of that list were former addicts who had found the strength to rise from the bottom. The Council still bought from the Italians. Madonna's accomplice would leave a car with a trunk full of heroin in a Manhattan parking lot and a few days later pick it up with a trunk full of cash. The trunk held about 100 kilograms of heroin, which cost Barnes about $2.5 million. At first, Barnes would get the goods on loan, which he was supposed to pay back in a month. The heroin was then taken to one of Barnes's rented apartments, where hired women packaged the entire product into 141,000 portions. It took them about 2 days to make the portions, followed by another 24 hours of thorough cleaning of the apartment. Barnes spared no expense. Each of the packers received $115,000 as a reward for their labor. One portion of heroin, equal to the so-called New York quarter, approximately equal to a large tablespoon, cost about $70. The final revenue for all realized goods reached about $10 million. Barnes's goods were especially popular with small street vendors. Knowing the great quality of his heroin, dealers broke a quarter of it into smaller doses, which were then diluted. Even this diluted product was quickly bought up by customers. The entire city was divided among the council members. Guy Fisher got the South Bronx, while Ismail Muhammad, Frank James, and Wallace Rice all got the East Side. Barnes, along with Joseph Hayton, sold merchandise in his native Harlem. Each council member had an alternate who supervised a dozen mid-level dealers, and each of these dealers managed no fewer than 40 street vendors. If you roughly counted everyone involved in the process, the figure would be several thousand people. The council was making fantastic profits. In the summer of 1973, Barnes set a record after selling a 200 kilograms batch of goods, earning the council a profit of $20 million. Soon, Barnes's business outgrew New York City. His product was so good that dealers from Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Oakland came for it. By 1976, he could rightly call his council an international company because his heroin was even being sold in Canada. Barnes led a lavish lifestyle and frequented the best nightclubs in the city. He remained faithful to his youthful precepts, always trying to dress expensively and flashily. His suits were custom-made. His closet contained 300 suits, 50 leather coats, and about 100 pairs of shoes. Barnes also had a special passion for expensive cars. His garage housed a Bentley, a Citroën SM, a Maserati, a Mercedes-Benz 300 SE, several Cadillacs, and a yellow Volvo. Realizing that such a fleet of cars would attract the attention of the tax authorities, he created a network of fictitious companies that supposedly leased him cars on a long-term basis. Barnes also did not forget about charity. Since 1974, New York had begun to hold the so-called Harlem Weeks, annual events designed to acquaint New Yorkers with the culture of black neighborhoods. Barnes helped orphans and single mothers, distributed turkeys on Thanksgiving, and gave free gifts to children on Christmas Eve. The fact that this apparent prosperity was made possible by turning Harlem into a ghetto was conveniently ignored. Between 1970 and 1974, the number of heroin addicts in the country doubled, and Harlem was the most vivid illustration of these statistics. However, Barnes later treated it philosophically. He said, "Yes, I filled the streets of the city with powder, but if I hadn't done it, someone else would have, whether it was an Italian or a Latino. And you can be sure that none of them would have ever given one dime back to Harlem." During this period, drugs became a topic of concern for the nation's top leaders. In 1971, President Richard Nixon declared at a White House briefing that drug addiction was public enemy number one in the United States. He asserted that to fight and defeat this enemy, an all-out offensive was necessary. However, the New York state government did not know how to mount that offensive. The only solution offered by the state's governor, Nelson Rockefeller, was the toughest anti-drug laws in the country. The sale of 2 ounces of heroin, cocaine, morphine, opium, or marijuana was punishable by imprisonment for 15 to 25 years, and possession of 4 ounces or more carried the same penalty. This strict policy failed to curb the increasing number of drug users, and Barnes found it laughable. He believed that the solution to New York's drug trafficking issue should have begun with arresting every detective from the Special Investigations Division. He argued that all the drug dealers in New York were aware of these detectives' involvement in drug dealing. Barnes was somewhat accurate in 1972, as the entire city was buzzing about a scandal at a police warehouse filled with confiscated goods and evidence. The police planned to catalog the seized drugs, but the suitcases from a 1962 investigation, which were supposed to contain drugs, were found to be filled with flour and starch. The identity and timing of the theft remained a mystery, and the only suspect, a New York City police detective named Joseph Enzi, was later found dead in his car. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but rumors quickly spread that Joseph was murdered. The governor, in an attempt to soothe the public, only managed to strengthen the existing laws, sentencing all dealers caught red-handed to life in prison without parole. This measure was seen as overly harsh by many, leading Mayor John Lindsay to criticize the governor's law as harsh and unfair. The public was calmed when a high-profile drug trafficker was arrested, proving that the law was not just targeting small-time sellers but also the major players in the drug trade. The authorities then sought the media's help to publicize this arrest. A few days after the Rockefeller Act was passed on January 8, 1973, the New Yorker magazine featured an article on Barnes, titled Untouchable's 11 Top Names in the City's Drug Trade. Barnes later expressed regret about the article, noting that while New Yorkers were willing to pay for their photos to be published in the paper, they were free to do so. Other journalists tried to outdo each other, fueling the controversy. The media had previously spread false stories about Barnes, claiming he was part of a black mafia and a member of the Symbian Liberation Army, a left-wing terrorist group known for bank robberies and murders. Barnes didn't care about the fictitious stories in the newspapers. He believed he enjoyed attention from the press because of his photogenic nature. Newspapers are interested in selling more copies, and the best way to increase circulation is to put a photo of Nicky Barnes in a luxurious suit on the cover. No one is going to buy a newspaper with Jose Rosa on the cover. Rosa was a major drug dealer in the Hispanic section of Harlem, and according to Barnes, he had the most disgusting face. The Rockefeller Act became effective on September 1, 1973. On August 29, Nicky returned to New York from Detroit, where he had been meeting with a lawyer. At the airport, Nicky was supposed to meet his wife, but she wasn't there. Alarmed, Barnes called home, and his wife told him there was no electricity in the area, the elevator in their building wasn't working, and she wouldn't go down the stairs in the dark with a 1-year-old child in her arms. Barnes reassured her, saying, "Stay calm, honey. I'll take a cab and see you soon." When Barnes arrived home and reassured his wife, he left on business. The next day, he was met by 15 police officers near his 13th floor apartment. They handcuffed him and proceeded to search his apartment. Perhaps the lawmen expected to find a huge drug lab, but instead, they found Barnes' terrified wife nursing their daughter. The cops searched the apartment but found only $50,000 in cash and a few guns. Barnes became agitated when a policeman emerged from his bedroom carrying a leather travel bag. Nicky was sure the policeman had planted drugs in it, but to his surprise, it contained only documents and dirty clothes. The agent's loot wasn't much. The sniffer dogs found only a marijuana joint butt in the bathroom. While Barnes was in Detroit, police thought he had fled to the Caribbean islands to avoid the Rockefeller law. They had been tapping Barnes' phone and thought the phrase "stay calm, honey" was some kind of code. When surveillance reported that Barnes got out of a cab with a large leather bag, suspicions grew. After questioning the cabbie and learning he picked up Barnes near the airport, the cops decided they were lucky. In those years, airport security wasn't strict, so couriers often carried drugs in their hand luggage. The police imagined a bag full of heroin from France or Vietnam, and their doubts were dispelled when they saw Barnes walking home. Since the house had no electricity, Barnes had to run up 13 flights of stairs. The police decided Nicky ran the 13 floors on foot, fearing an ambush at the elevator doors. Based on these observations, the judge granted a search warrant. In his book, Nicky Barnes openly mocks the police, seeing the search as a desperate attempt to justify 8 months of a fruitless investigation. The cops, in his opinion, spent too much time and money and had to prove their worth. Barnes recounts being under constant surveillance, with his phone tapped and agents parked across the street from his home 24/7. Despite all that effort, it was ultimately in vain. Barnes' version is that the cops conducted the search without hope of finding anything incriminating, signaling that times had changed and Barnes couldn't operate as easily as before. Nicky Barnes tried not to think about the lawmen or the Rockefeller law. He didn't take the cops seriously at the time. Barnes was more concerned with money laundering. As he claimed, if you drive a Maserati, own several penthouses, and report an income of only $330,000 a year, the IRS will take an interest. Barnes didn't want to repeat Al Capone's fate. Thanks to his lawyer, he found a way to make the tax system work for him. In America, there was, and still is, the FHA Federal Housing Administration, founded by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to ensure mortgage loans, providing access to affordable mortgages for low and middle-income people. Barnes leveraged the system for his benefit. He would buy properties and then sell them to associates or dummy buyers at inflated prices, laundering his drug money through legitimate real estate transactions. This method allowed him to amass significant wealth while maintaining a low profile regarding his actual income. Barnes also diversified his investments, putting money into businesses that appeared legitimate on the surface but were fronts for his drug operations. By doing this, he created layers of transactions that made it difficult for law enforcement to trace the origins of his wealth. Despite his careful planning, Barnes knew he couldn't stay under the radar forever. He was always looking over his shoulder, aware that the authorities were closing in. The pressure intensified with the enforcement of the Rockefeller laws, which aimed to crack down on drug trafficking with severe penalties. Barnes's luxurious lifestyle and conspicuous spending made him a prime target for law enforcement. He understood that one wrong move could lead to his downfall, much like many infamous gangsters before him. The day the police raided his apartment was a wake-up call. Although they didn't find the incriminating evidence they were hoping for, the search itself was a clear message. The net was tightening. Barnes realized that the game had changed, and he needed to adapt if he wanted to stay ahead of the law. He doubled down on his efforts to conceal his activities, becoming even more meticulous in his operations. Yet, the constant surveillance and pressure from the authorities made it increasingly difficult to maintain his empire. Barnes decided to invest his drug money in FHA projects, such as constructing residential apartment complexes, allowing him to launder millions through the organization. Additionally, he was entitled to a half-tax abatement during construction. Nicky enjoyed fantasizing about where he could invest his clean money. In his book, Barnes wrote that his dream was to build a huge shopping mall in Harlem and create a nationwide network of automated car washes. Such investments would instantly transform Nicky Barnes from a drug dealer into a respectable businessman. Another problem was the large amount of cash on hand. Barnes found a solution here as well. The director of the local church, which Barnes often attended with his wife, helped him. He would take the money and store it in the church's endowment fund. This service cost Nicky 2% of the amount, quite a lot, but in cases where bail was required, neither the judge nor the prosecutor questioned the money's origin. The church's reputation was not questioned. However, sometimes even those tricks didn't work. On May 11, 1974, Nicky Barnes was arrested by police on suspicion of murder. The judge set bail at $100,000. The rector of the church brought the full amount the next day, but Bronx District Attorney Mario Merola rejected it. He also convinced the judge to hold a hearing on where the poor parish would get such a huge sum of money. The rector's explanation did not convince the prosecution, as the church had only $330 in its account at the time of Barnes's arrest. Bail was denied. Attempts to get Nicky out from behind bars continued for almost 2 months until his attorney brought the necessary amount, explaining that the money was part of Barnes's real estate investment. Mr. Untouchable found himself free, but the press discussed the episode for a long time. It wasn't the first accusation against Barnes, but it was the one that nearly destroyed his entire empire. Journalists didn't just write about Nicky Barnes, they made him a star. Every reader now knew him by sight, and so it was too risky to resume face-to-face meetings with Madonna. Anticipating this development, Barnes sent his associate, Guy Fisher. However, their relationship did not go well from the beginning. According to Madonna, Fisher did not show him the proper respect. On top of all this, there was another unpleasant episode for Fisher. Guy had a conflict with 2 of his small-time dealers. They were arrested by police and had to hand over the proceeds and the rest of their merchandise. Guy considered this an insult and shot them. Both dead council members considered murder to be the most extreme measure that could be taken. The decision to kill someone was always made collectively and had to be unanimous. Guy Fisher decided to disregard these formalities and carried out a lynching. In response to the outrage of Barnes and the others, he declared that since those dealers were his subordinates, he alone had the right to decide what to do with them. Fisher was increasingly in trouble. On September 30, 1974, he went to meet with Matthew Madonna, who was to give him the keys to a car loaded with heroin. He had $100,000 in cash with him. On the way, Guy committed a traffic violation and was stopped by police. During the ID check, Guy gave the cops his fake driver's license, after which they decided to search the car. When they saw a bag of cash in the trunk, Guy offered to let them take the money and let him go. Guy Fisher was instantly arrested and charged with attempted bribery. The money was confiscated, and Barnes had to splurge. He bailed Fisher out and paid off Madonna. However, when Fisher paid Barnes back for his bail, he paid $5,000 less. Nicky later recalled that it was at this point that he had some doubts about Fisher, but he didn't give them much thought at the time. Guy Fisher, too, dreamed of becoming a legitimate businessman, but he thought differently from Barnes. If Nicky was looking for real and workable options, Fisher caught fire with the idea of buying the Apollo Theater. This concert hall, in the early 20th century, played an important role in the history of African American music, but in the 70s, it languished in a fairly miserable existence. Fisher believed that buying the Apollo would make their business more respectable. The theater was up for auction for only $500,000 and had great tax benefits as a historic landmark. While the council was preparing for the purchase, another unfortunate incident occurred. In 1976, they lost their supplier, Matthew Madonna, and needed to urgently find a new one. One of the board members praised the merchandise of a Mexican dealer, Benito Cortina. Barnes spent $250,000 to buy the first shipment, but he was not impressed with the quality of the heroin. Unlike Madonna's snow-white heroin from Marseille, the product from Mexico was dark brown and resembled dirt. But there were no other options, and he had to buy it. Barnes' underlings spent a good deal of time turning those brown lumps into white powder. At the same time, the trial of Guy Fisher took place. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison for the incident in which he offered to bribe police officers. After Fisher's trial, Barnes's trial also began. A full 3 years had passed since the search of Nicky's apartment, but the prosecution still managed to bring the case to trial. Barnes was tried before a Manhattan jury. The protagonists of the trial were police sniffer dogs. According to prosecutors, the dogs sniffed Barnes's cars in the garage and made barking noises, indicating that the trunk had recently contained drugs. The dogs made the same barking noise when Nicky's apartment was searched. In the prosecutor's view, this clearly indicated that drugs were stored in the car and the apartment. Eager to convince the jury, the prosecutors brought 2 boxes into the room, one of which contained heroin. When the dogs approached this box, they began barking. Barnes's attorney asked to remove those boxes from the courtroom and then brought his own. When he placed his box in front of the dogs, they began barking fiercely. The lawyer hastened to show the contents of the box to those present. It contained aspirin. A few hours later, Barnes dined with his lawyer at an Italian restaurant. Mr. Untouchable had once again confirmed his nickname. This, however, was Barnes's last victory over justice. The Mexican product did not sell as well as Madonna's Marseille powder. All the members of the council searched day and night for new suppliers, but not all of them were careful. Joseph Hayden claimed to have found a supplier that would solve all their problems. He was Louis D. who, according to Hayden, could get anything from a Sherman tank to a ton of heroin at a fabulously low price. He would be happy to help Barnes, but he was having a little money trouble. So, Hayden decided to disregard the council's rules a little and had already paid him for 2 kilos of heroin. Nicky was furious. Joseph had a reputation as an irresponsible guy before, but this case had surpassed all the previous ones. He had gone behind Barnes's back to arrange a major purchase with essentially the first person he met. Barnes drove himself to the meeting where he was arrested. This happened on the night of March 15 to 16, 1977. It wasn't just Nicky who was arrested. The police also arrested Joseph Hayden, Guy Fisher who had not yet been sent to serve his time, and several other dealers involved with the council. More than $30 million in cash was also seized. The judge set bail at $300,000, which Barnes paid, allowing him to meet with his attorney. After familiarizing himself with the case file, Barnes concluded that Louis D. was a special agent of the DEA, Luis Diaz. Diaz had long been working undercover, posing as a mafia partner, forced to wander from family to family and occasionally dealing drugs. That's how Diaz was able to get in touch with one of Joseph Hayden's associates and then with Hayden himself. Barnes's associates, eager to prove their usefulness and independence to him, unknowingly gave Diaz many secrets of the organization. Meanwhile, Barnes's lawyer was contacted by the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine, Fred Ferretti. The editor informed the lawyer that an article on Mr. Untouchable would be published in a forthcoming issue and that he wanted Nicky to pose for the cover. The lawyer replied that, with a few months before the trial, his client didn't want to draw too much attention to himself, so he wouldn't pose. The editor politely thanked the lawyer and hung up. However, a couple of hours later, the publication's executive editor contacted him, saying he had a photo of Barnes taken the night of his arrest. If Barnes refused to pose, they would use the police photo on the cover of the New York Times. Barnes decided to agree since potential jurors would be reading the magazine, and they would not be allowed to see the police station photo. The trial was set to be held in Manhattan, so Nicky decided to dress for the photo shoot in a way that a juror from Manhattan, a middle-class man, could see him looking like himself. Barnes chose to wear a plain, casual suit of light-colored denim and a red, white, and blue tie. In the photo, he stood in front of the camera, modestly but with dignity, holding his hands in front of him. The Sunday supplement issue of the New York Times Magazine with Barnes on the cover was published on June 5, 1977. The caption under the photo read, "This is Nicky Barnes." The police say he may be Harlem's biggest drug dealer, but can they prove it? Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, liked to start his day by reading the latest press. He was impressed by the arrogance he saw in Nicky Barnes's posture. It's rumored that at that moment, he uttered the phrase, "If we can't arrest this man, then there is something wrong with our justice system." The U.S. Attorney General received a personal order from the president to take all measures to put Mr. Untouchable behind bars. A few months later, Barnes was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The court went to unprecedented lengths to avoid pressure and ensure the safety of the jury. The verdict was rendered by the first anonymous jury in U.S. history, consisting of 15 people whose names, residences, ages, and occupations were kept secret. At first, the counsel only gave Barnes good news in prison. However, as time went on, rumors began to reach Barnes that the counsel's affairs had become so bad that Guy Fisher had even abandoned the idea of buying the Apollo Theater. The bad news didn't end there. During one of their visits, Barnes's wife informed him that she had seen Guy Fisher at a basketball game in the company of Barnes's mistress, Shamika. In the opinion of Barnes's wife, something was going on between Shamika and Guy Fisher. This news infuriated Nicky. He had noticed before that Shamika was treating Guy too well, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. The council's rules forbade any relationship between its members and each other's wives or mistresses, and violation of that rule was punishable by death. Without concrete evidence, Barnes couldn't accuse Guy directly, so he first decided to ask Shamika herself. When she showed up for a prison visit, she told Barnes that nothing had ever happened between her and Guy. Nicky calmed down for a while. 6 months later, Barnes met a member of Guy Fisher's gang in prison, a man everyone called JJ. According to JJ, in the 3 years he spent behind bars, Guy never visited him once. JJ also told Barnes a story about his comrade Bob, who was out on parole. The council was supposed to pay Bob $500 for every week he spent in prison, but when Bob demanded the money owed to him, Fisher refused. Bob's misadventures didn't end there. While he was in prison, his girlfriend became Fisher's mistress. Thanks to a small bribe, Barnes was able to use the phone in the break room. After contacting several subordinates, Nicky learned the true state of affairs. Most of the heroin suppliers refused to cooperate with the council because Guy Fisher didn't pay them on time. The product from the remaining suppliers was of worse quality, and the small dealers were having problems selling it. This news shocked Barnes. He had put a lot of time and effort into building a sterling reputation for his product, and his successors had botched it. The council had even stopped paying Nicky's lawyers. Barnes's doubts were finally dispelled by a letter received a month later. In a large envelope were photos of Shamika with Guy at dinner and during a basketball game. In one picture, Guy was kissing Shamika. The envelope did not have the sender's name on it, but along with the photos, there was a short note from the Drug Enforcement Administration. Barnes wasn't initially going to cooperate with the authorities. He had received offers to turn in his associates before but had always responded with a firm refusal. Now, realizing he would not receive help from the council, he changed his mind. Driven by a desire to send his former comrades to prison, Barnes decided to stop at nothing and tell all the murders committed by the council. On January 4, 1983, Barnes appeared before a grand jury and laid out all the crimes he had committed with the council since 1973. Nicky pleaded guilty to drug trafficking and participating in the decision-making process to commit 4 murders. On March 10 of that year, Guy Fisher was arrested. In August 1998, Nicky Barnes, already 64 years old, was released from prison. This was due in no small part to the U.S. Attorney General Rudolph Giuliani, who succeeded in getting Barnes's life sentence overturned. Since then, Barnes has been in the Witness Protection Program, rumored to be living somewhere in the Midwest. On June 18, 2012, Nicky Barnes passed away from cancer. The information about his death did not hit the media until the summer of 2019. The story of Nicky Barnes can hardly be called instructive. Life practically did not give him a chance to choose another non-drug-related path. Mr. Untouchable evokes neither horror nor pity. He was as unique as the Harlem of the 70s, which is now a thing of the past. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into the secret world of Mafia Titans fascinating, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth stories and revelations. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Share this video with friends who love uncovering the hidden truths of history's most notorious figures. Stay tuned for more incredible stories from the underworld.